Welcome to the University of Wisconsin at River Falls. We hope you enjoy today's talk by Dr. Mary Poplin, brought to you by our local chapter of Cru and another Cru ministry, Faculty Commons. We'll let the latter's regional director, Dave Johnson, take it from here.
We're going to go ahead and start so we can get out on time. For those of you that haven't met me, Dave Johnson, on staff with Cru, specifically the Faculty Commons Division that works with faculty and staff across the nation. Cru is a student organization here on campus. So today we're very privileged to have Dr. Mary Poplin as our guest speaker. She received her PhD from the University of Texas in special ed. And she's a professor of education at Claremont Graduate University, if you're familiar with that, there in California. She served as the Director of Teacher Education and Dean of the School of Educational Studies. In 1966, she worked for 2 months with Mother Teresa and the Missionaries of Charity in Calcutta to understand why Mother Teresa said that their work was religious work, not social work. Interesting. And she does have a book called Finding Calcutta. Academically, she explores the contemporary intellectual trends dominant in various academic disciplines, the sciences, humanities, social sciences. And then in 2014, she published her book, Is Reality Secular? Testing the Assumptions of Four Global Worldviews. And she'll be relating to that topic today at lunch. She's a frequent speaker at Veritas forums. I don't know if any of you have heard of those at major universities across the country. And so we're really thankful that she has time. If at the end she has time for a few questions, hopefully you can take that. She'll take that. We want to end at 10 till so you can get to your 1 o'clocks. But you feel free to hang around and talk to her personally if you want to. So please welcome with me Dr. Mary Poplin.
Thank you. It's beautiful here. Neither Texas nor California really has a fall like this. And I said they were beautiful. And Dave kept saying to me, no, you should have been here last week. But they're still beautiful to someone like me, so I'm grateful. So I'm going to describe how does a professor who's sort of a feminist, a multiculturalist, a critical theorist come to actually ask the question, is reality secular? So I'm going to give you a quick sort of overview of that. First of all, my field is the education of the poor. That's really the thing that I've always worked in. And I've spoken earlier today about a study that we did of highly effective teachers in the worst schools in Los Angeles. And there's quite a number of those to choose from. And then I'm going along teaching in sort of those areas, critical theory, multicultural education, feminist education, and things like that. And then I received tenure in May of 1992, and in November of 1992, I have an unsettling dream. So it's a dream that I remembered every single detail. It's a dream that had color in it. It was a dream where I realized the condition of my soul. I mean, I was kind of a free spirit. I was doing all sorts of interesting things with my life. And at the end of the dream, I actually see Jesus. Now, I had grown up in a church, but had not been to church since I went to college. And so I'm 42 years old. And when I saw him, I had this immediate revelation to myself of the filth inside me. So that was pretty unsettling. And within 6 weeks, I was in this little church, and I just knelt down at communion, and I said, if you're real, please come get me. And at the end of the dream, I had this sense of peace that I had never had before, and after I said that, I had the same sense of peace. So that's where this whole journey starts. After that, I would try different places. I was at monasteries. I was at both Protestant and Catholic events. And I was at a monastery in New Mexico, and I saw a film of Mother Teresa. I'm not going to talk much about Mother Teresa now because I'm going to talk about her tonight. But in the film, there's a line that she says that really caught my attention. And she said, our work is not social work, it's religious work. Okay, so now I've been, struggling to understand Christianity for about a year, and then she says that, and in this film, this documentary, and I thought, I really need to know what she means by that. So I had a sabbatical coming up in spring of 1996, and I wrote them in the fall of 95 and asked if I could come and volunteer, and they said yes. And so I went, and I was there for 2 months. The last thing Mother Teresa said to me, okay, I was sitting on a bench, and she walked up to me. She only said probably 5 things. I'm not suggesting we were really buds or anything. And I'm sure she probably didn't even know my name. But I was sitting on a bench waiting for some materials to take back to the center where I worked. And she walked up to me, and we were eye to eye because she was as tall as I am sitting. So she pointed her finger at me and started shaking it. People always ask me if she was sweet. I think every time Mother Teresa spoke to me, she was doing this. Okay, well, yeah, if you want to call it sweet. So she said to me, God does not call everybody to work with the poor. Now, she doesn't know anything about me, right? God does not call everybody to work with the poor like he called us to work with. And God does not call everybody to live poor like he calls us to live. But God does call everybody to a Calcutta. You have to find yours. Okay, now I'm 42 years old. I'm a tenured professor, and this little lady is basically telling me I don't know what I'm supposed to be about, right? And I'm still looking for it. Okay, so I get back, I return, and clearly I begin to have this pretty much intellectual crisis. And for several months, it would manifest like this. I would get ready, I would go into my office, I'd be working on my things, I'd start to get my things together for class, and I would start to uncontrollably weep without an emotion ahead of time. This is weird. And I didn't know what to do. And so I just prayed, I need to understand this. And that answer didn't come for a couple of months. And then all of a sudden I realized that what I believed now I was definitely not teaching. And I wasn't even comfortable putting it in as a part of the class. And so my sort of central sense of myself was I felt like a liar. Like I lived these 2 lives, and one of them, I wasn't like integrating them at all. And so that began a struggle. And then Dallas Willard was a professor at USC, and many of you probably know him and his writings, and he would do a lot of faculty conferences around the area. And the last few faculty conferences I went to, he kept asking all of us this question: what does Jesus think of your discipline? What does Jesus think of your field? You need to know what that is, right? Well, none of us were really doing that. And then I began to sort of explore the larger picture of the university and where we were and how we got there. And, all the universities basically come out of monasteries and then Christian denominations. They, until you get to the late, and universities begin in the 1100s, and you can, Oxford and Paris both decide that they fight over whether one was first or the other. But they basically merged out of monasteries. And then in particular, the Protestant universities began to give in to secularism, largely through the influence, I think, of a theologian named Poplin, who was a German theologian, who said, you know what, we just need to make Jesus sound like the rest of the world wants him to sound. We just need to take away all of the mystical qualities, all the miracles, all that. We need to get rid of that, and we need to just use his basic principles. And so that's how pretty much the university began as inclusive of secularism, or it began to turn that way, so it would be inclusive of secularism. But then eventually it's gotten to the place where secularism is actually the main game in town, right? So it is exclusively secular now, pretty much, unless you're at a Christian university, and even some of those have gone a lot toward secularism. So that's where a Christian professor finds himself, or a Christian at a university, anybody else who's religious too, really. And the issue is for secularism, and this is the thing that really helped me. There is another book. I'm not recommending you buy these books, by the way. It's certainly not this one. This is actually, I had a friend who was also just like me. He was actually a Jewish atheist, and he moved away to Indiana, and we had done some student things together in California. And he emails me about 5 years ago and said, gosh, I just Googled you. You know, you always think, oh, no. I just Googled you, and I see you became a Christian. And then the next sentence was, you are not going to believe this. I did too. Okay, so he said, what do I do? And I said, well, I've proposed this session at the American Educational Research Association. We're going to talk about the problems of secularism. And you could just be the discussant, because a discussant doesn't have to come out. They don't have to, agree with the papers. You just have to talk about the papers. And he said, okay, I will. So he did that. And then after he did that, of course, he came out then. But ARA had scheduled us for 7 o'clock in the morning, so there weren't that many people. And then he kept saying to me, what I do now? And I said, do you still have that contract with that sort of running contract with that Marxist publisher, the critical theory publisher, Peter Lang? And he said, well, I don't know. Maybe I do. I said, I think you need to call up Peter Lang and tell them that the only radical thing left in the university is Christianity. And he did. So they just published a book called Judeo-Christianity and the Secular Border Patrol, the loss of Judeo-Christian knowledge in the university. So why do I think that's a problem? I had to ask myself when I got back from Mother Teresa's a really strong question. And that was, why does Mother Teresa not make it in the feminist literature, right? Why did I never present her as a feminist? Here's a woman, little lady, from a little country in Europe who moves away to India. She ends up creating the most lucrative group inside the Catholic Church, right? The Missionaries of Charity. By far, we're getting, at least last time I checked, we're getting more money than any other group. And they have a rule that they can never ask for money. So if you ever get anything in the mail that says, send money to Mother Teresa, it is not from them. So, but I had to ask myself, here's this woman who's running this worldwide organization. It's a social justice-oriented organization. And why didn't she make it? Why was that not a part of what we were doing? So one part of that book is that I asked Stanley Fish, Stanley Fish is that radical, a lot of you know him, I'm sure, kind of a radical postmodern humanities guy. And he writes for the New York Times and Huffington Post and things. And he occasionally has defended religious belief and doctrines and thinking through intellectually. And when I asked him, he actually sent an endorsement, and this is what he says, and the reason I'm going to read it is that this is the best description of secularism, actually. I mean, Stanley Fish is like that. He can make one sentence and it can make everything clear. Whether you agree with him or not, he makes it clear. So he said, for most Americans, and this would also include Europeans, secularism is the air we breathe. It's invisible and it's sustaining and terribly limiting all at the same time. The most powerful of all modern ideologies derives its power from the claim to be above, below, or to the side of ideology. Okay, so that is kind of where secularism stands. It sort of claims a sort of neutral ground. And so it has become pretty much the central part of most universities. And then I discovered that there are a number of atheist European philosophers who actually have come to the same conclusion. And probably the most radical one is Jürgen Habermas, who calls himself a methodological atheist. I'm not sure what that means, and he basically says that everything that the West loves about itself, egalitarianism, all these different things, actually came out of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And he said, since then we have nothing, everything else has been postmodern chatter. Now that is a pretty strong statement. So his suggestion is that we have to go back and recover those roots. Another atheist who's an Italian philosopher and political philosopher, Marcello Pera, has written a book. He also claims to be an atheist, but the name of his book is Why We Should Call Ourselves Christian. Not why we should be that, but why we should call ourselves Christian. I was convinced that that was a misinterpretation when it was translated into English, but I had my Italian-speaking friend to look it up on Italian Amazon, and sure enough, that is the title of the original book. So he says something that's, I'd like to kind of quote his brief statement. If I have it. Maybe I left it up there. Anyway, what he basically says is it's the same thing. We have to go back to Judeo-Christianity because that's where we got lost. And this is the foundation of everything we love in the West. And the reason that everybody wants to come to the West is because that we have these kinds of freedoms. So how does it appear in the academic literature? I'll give you a couple of examples. And then I'll give you a different example. But let's say Samuel Huntington's book a few years ago became very popular, called The Clash of World Civilizations. And in his book, he actually says that that the problem of the new century, says the 20th century conflict between liberal democracy and Marxist-Leninist thought is only a fleeting and superficial historical phenomenon compared to the continuing and deeply conflictual relation between Islam and Christianity. Now, hidden in the sentence, this was written after 9/11, are a couple of assumptions. First of all, that most of the world's troubles are coming from religion. We haven't had a religious war in a very long time. And secondly, the assumption sort of puts religion at the center of the world conflicts and leaves secularism out completely uncontested. Now, the most interesting thing is that oddly enough, if you look at bin Laden's letter about why 9/11, right? It's not an attack on Christianity. It is an attack on the proliferation and mass dispensation of secular economic and moral norms that the West is putting out to the rest of the world. So if you really think about it, in 9/11, they hit the trade towers, the economic center, the Pentagon, they tried the White House, but it wasn't not the National Cathedral. This is like, it's sort of like secularism is so much a part of us that we never actually think that these assumptions that we have embedded in us by having grown up in this culture actually need to be challenged, right? So those kinds of things go on. You look in psychology research and they find over and over that immediate forgiveness of other people is related to life satisfaction and life longevity. And that people in the studies tell them that it's because the reason they forgive people unconditionally is because they've been unconditionally forgiven by God. Now that always ends up being interpreted, even if it's not in the data, as the fact that people go to church. So remember bowling alone? We just need some more organizations where people get together. Well, if you really look deeply in that research, going to church and attending prayer groups is actually insignificant in these people's research. And this research is on like 3,000 people, right? It's an insignificant statistic. The statistic between believing in God and forgiving is 0.0001. Okay, it's the most significant statistic they actually have in the entire study, but it's just brushed off as, well, we don't know what that is like. It must be about going to church, right? So these are the kinds of distortions that I have found pretty disturbing, and it's not like this is something that most of us are aware of. It's just like the interesting thing about so Judeo-Christianity has a moral tether. It has a wide variety of people who believe in it, and we can argue and disagree for sure. But there is a moral tether. There is a sort of a limit to what is okay, right? Secularism doesn't have any kind of permanent moral tether at all. And so secularism is both the foundation, it can be both the foundation of the alt-left and the alt-right, right? There's no there. So it's just a sort of academic thought without a there, I guess you'd call it. That's not very articulate. So what do I believe that the university, so I've come to the conclusion that secularism has hurt the university in a number of ways. First, otherwise really highly educated people go through the university never studying the fact that 90% of the world believes in some spiritual doctrines. So obviously the largest one would be Christianity, followed by Islam and Hinduism. So there are these spiritual beliefs in the world, but we don't really study them very seriously, except possibly in religion programs. Secondly, I believe that secularism has reduced our commitment to the wholehearted search for truth. This has these limits on searching for truth. And thirdly, that it contradicts our own self-professed commitment to pluralism. That is, the university professes to be the seat of pluralism, but then there are just these particular things that we limit. And Stephen Smith, who's a political scientist at San Diego, says it leaves us with speech codes. We obviously have speech codes. And he says it makes you have this sort of thin, desiccated public discourse. So certain speech is privileged over the other. And then I think the other thing that has happened in the university is that we're more comfortable with these interfaith movements. And the interfaith movements they're not bad movements. They're movements where students from different faiths come together to maybe serve the poor, serve in soup kitchens and things like that. That's good, but it doesn't actually, it sort of morphs the distinguishing features of the various religious frameworks. And if you talk to pretty seriously religious people, students, they don't actually go there. That's not, they're going to these other things on and outside the university. So I think what I'd like to do is stop there and open for questions, because we only have about 10 more minutes. Questions or comments? Good.
I just need clarification if I understood correctly. You mentioned Judeo-Christianity being the starting point for forgiveness. Did I understand that?
No, it's not the starting point. There is a very specific, it's one of the central tenets is radical forgiveness of other people and forgiveness of us. So the idea is that if I sin, which really just means I've missed the mark of human flourishing, so I realize I did something to somebody or something, and in addition to just asking for their forgiveness, we ask Christ to forgive us, right? And in that transaction, that's a spiritual transaction, in that transaction, we are both forgiven and cleansed from it. Okay, so there's two kind of actions that in Christianity we believe take place then. And that is because in Christianity, Christ came and went through every single temptation known to man and without sinning, so that when he was killed, then he took on the sins of the world. So he could forgive the sins and cleanse you from it. I guess the best example I've had is this. When I was in graduate school, there were these things called Friday night movies, which were basically early pornography at the University of Texas. Austin is still weird, and it's gotten much weirder though. This was a long time ago. And throughout my various relationships, I would watch pornography and things like that. And when I came to Christ, I knew it was not right and it was evil and wasn't doing anything for me. And so I asked to be forgiven from it. And immediately, I never had another desire to see it, right? That desire was just completely taken away. Secondly, but though, is I could be driving down the LA freeway, and believe it or not, you can spend a very long time on the LA freeway. Like it's about as long as you can drive from the airport to here. You can just try to get through LA. And scenes from those things would come into my mind, and they were, they trouble you because you've like moved on, right? So I would say, even out loud in the car, if I were alone, God, you saw that, and I saw that, and I ask you to forgive me and to cleanse me. Not just forgive me, but cleanse me. And then within about a year, I'd never had those things either. So I believe that is an actual transaction that we don't understand because we don't really understand how to study what I call spiritual transactions, or what some people call miracles, or healings, or different things like that. We don't really know how to study that. There are people. There is some new work by Elaine Eklund studying miracles. And there is a man who's not one of the big showmen on TV, but who was a Baptist pastor in, I think, Texas. And he has a ministry where when he prays for people, a lot of times they get healed. And he actually then went back and got a PhD so he could learn how to document and how to follow up and make sure, to see the truth. How long does this last? Does it last? So they follow up anybody like that for years, actually, to see if it's right, still true.
And so you're talking only about Christianity, because to my knowledge, and I'm not a scholar of world religions, but Judaism, to my knowledge, does not suggest that we forgive our fellow human, right? It's an eye for an eye, or am I wrong? And you don't need to answer that. I'm just, I understand now that you're just referencing Christianity. But there are those that might say that within Christianity, we are seeking forgiveness because we're afraid of the consequences of not being forgiven. Namely, we're afraid of hell. And that is our driving force, rather than a freer version of Christianity that perhaps you are experiencing. But there are a lot of large groups of Christians around the world that are terrified of what will happen if they're not good. And so it's really doing it for somebody else and for an ulterior motive. So what are your thoughts on that?
I'm sure I know there are people who do believe that, but that is not that's not what you would get from the Bible. And that's certainly not been my experience. My experience is that you get freer. You just get freer inside yourself, and then it is more possible for you to stop whatever it is you're doing, or maybe it happens immediately, like in the case I mentioned. But that's not. I mean, I guess surely there are Christians who are just fearful, but I don't think that's particularly a dominant belief about forgiveness or any of those things.
Hi, Mary.
Hi, Natasha.
Stuck with me is the phrase or the question, what does Jesus think of your discipline? Mm-hmm. Do you have some examples of how you integrated your faith with your discipline in the classroom? Right.
Well, I teach a course on pedagogical theories. And so I used to go through all the sort of behaviorism and constructivism, and I still do, critical theory and what's a feminist look at. And then I added the Judeo-Christian view, which goes all, it can start as early as looking at what Peter says about sort of the development of human beings. He says, add to your faith virtue, and to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control, and to self-control, it just kind of goes on down to the love of God. So up to the love of God, and so then I talk about what does a typical like classical Christian school look like, or classical Christian homeschool. And how the focus is on the good, the true, and the beautiful, which actually used to be the focus for the humanities in general. But now if you really look at what they do in the humanities, a lot of it's pretty dark. But the idea was you read literature that raised social issues, but had a way that those things could be transformed, and that has been a loss in the humanities, I think. So that's an example. I just integrate it. My students are, there's the Webb, so it's not like students take my class and don't know I'm a Christian or something, because they always Google you, right? So I just explain those things. Here's one way of seeing it. Here's another way of seeing it. And then they have options. I think my biggest concern is not that we teach only a Christian doctrine in education or any other field. It's that people know the doctrine, know that there's alternatives. Like, I grew up in the age of, we all read I'm Okay, You're Okay. Do you remember that book? Some of you are as old as me. I'm Okay, You're Okay. And that's kind of the foundation of secular psychology. But in Christianity, it's I'm not okay. You're not either, but there is redemption, right? And the redemptive part, I used the confessional thing, the redemptive part changes you inside. It's not just a patch or a way to stop or something like that. It actually does have a transformative effect on your mind and your soul. So, spirit. Yes? Okay, sorry.
I belong to a community, liberation and community.
Uh-huh.
I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's Catholic.
Uh-huh.
But we were just talking last night about rationalism, and it ties in with what you're talking about in that we are being told that there is only secular rationalism, and it discounts anything transcendent.
Right.
And what you're saying about being changed, it's like that is an event that
Yes.
happened.
Yes.
But you can't scientifically prove it.
Right.
So we discount that.
Yes, but you can't scientifically prove the other either.
No.
But they don't require that of the other, right?
Right.
So, yes, that is really important. And I think there are a lot of Catholics doing work on this. And there is a Catholic philosopher in France, believe it or not, who's raising this issue, who says, we have got to go back. He's just like Habermas, the two atheists I mentioned. We have got to go back and recover some of this, because this is where human beings get better and human beings can come together, as opposed to what we're sort of moving into and what you're moved into before us, right? Yeah.
Yeah, if we have time. Do we have time for one more? And a follow-up?
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you could just elaborate a little bit on secularism positioning itself outside of ideology. And I ask because I'm sort of grounded in that secular humanism was an ideology that fundamentalists would often point to as an ideology that had taken over the university, taken over education, and so on.
Well, I think when people showed this, said, okay, so secular humanism has taken over the university, which is true, then they were really just, were they Christian? Were they coming from another standpoint, like a religious standpoint? When you're talking about the people who critiqued it?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That was their glimmer of what was going on, of what this is, and that is that we have changed as a nation, as a university, a system, all of these things, to where we don't have a single system that sort of forms our core, and that's what they recognized. And to tell you the truth, I think psychology is probably maybe the number one most antithetical field to Christianity. When you ask, what does Jesus think of my field? I think that it's completely the opposite, almost. And one of the other things besides the thing about I'm okay, you're okay, is this idea that to solve your psychological problems, you go back into the past. That is absolutely not a Christian principle. The principle in Christianity is I forget what's lying behind and I strain forward, reaching for the high call in my life. I'm always moving forward instead of trying to figure out what happened in the past. And so at least if psychology could recognize that there are these two very different systems, I think it would just make people, it gives you more, even just more intellectual fodder, right, when you're a student. So I think, I don't know, did I answer your question?
Yeah, the quick follow-up is, I think it's been pretty easy for me to say I don't like what secularism has done to the university or to public education more generally. But I also drank the Kool-Aid that we shouldn't be ideological either. And so what you've challenged me to think about is if secularism is outside of ideology, should we be more ideological?
Yeah. I think secularism is not outside ideology, but they claim it. So, and the other thing I'd have to say, which I probably should have said earlier, is there's a lot of secular work that does not conflict, that Christians would agree with. There's a big overlap. Sure. And then there are, depending on the field, there are these pretty serious differences. I'm sorry, there was something else I was going to mention. Well, I think that's the major point. It's not always, they're not so totally distinct, right?
Let's take a 3 or 4 minute break for any that have 1 o'clock and need to leave. If you want to stay and ask a few more questions, we'll let those people go ahead and leave. And then you can always ask her. Please fill out those response sheets and just put them in the middle of your table before you go. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation by Dr. Mary Poplin from the Riverview Ballroom in the University Center on the beautiful campus of the University of Wisconsin at River Falls. Thanks again to our local Cru leadership, Dave Johnson of Faculty Commons and UWRF's Fellowship of Christian Faculty and Staff. Thank you for watching, and remember, Jesus loves you.